very simply, 12x is derived or an improvement upon 4x, which is an established genre or subgenre of computer games. 4x means, and I have to focus to not get it wrong, explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. And that sums up or so explains what the genre is about. Usually it's applied to turn-based strategy games in the vein of Civilization. So Civilization is considered to be the game franchise that perfected or developed most 4X genre. But what I'm personally interested in and always have been is more of the sci-fi version of that. And in the sci-fi version of 4X games, where you're running a space empire, basically, the best game is Master of Orion 2. At least in my humble, correct opinion. It's Master of Orion 2, but it's just a bit of like a legendary game because it was developed still at the sort of cusp of the DOS era. But they were very ambitious and they developed pretty neat and by today's standards, modern and effective sort of UI, sort of the user interface or the graphics interface through which you play the game, which for such a game of such complexity as these types of games usually are, is actually very difficult to do. And many later games, including the sequels to Master of Orion, are worse at it than the sort of DOS, still like 640 by 480 DOS game was. So that's a bit disappointing. And in terms of game systems, like this sort of genre, and I've also written an article, sort of has a bit of an issue, is it's a bit fascist in that, like, if you sort of narrow it down into just these game elements, that like sort of you find stuff in space and you take it for yourself and you multiply your numbers and the size of your empire and then kill everyone else. That's basically what the Nazis were trying to do in the World War II exactly, which is sort of also interestingly a milestone in that in warfare, in that computer games in general, like strategy computer games in the sci-fi setting especially, are very much based on World War II. In that the Nazi part of it, like the people who started it and how they like what they would try to do with the like whole Lebensraum stuff. That's just like you're looking for living space to expand your numbers and defeat or all the other races, which like in the sci-fi setting, literally your opponents are other races. It's just like not other human races, but space alien races. But so it's like it has problems. So if you wanted to make a game like this to be both more realistic and more, let's just say, philosophically acceptable or ethical if you think about it, and in that sense also educational in like a good way, then what you need to do is, and I was sort of having a bit too much light, so I just close the window. So what I think you need to do is like there are some elements in reality that are not part of those games. And to the credit of Civilization, the series, they have expanded in terms of the game mechanics or game elements so that they got, by my measure, if like you count additional elements in the game or additional game systems, other X's, so they added, like they got to like 5x or 6x maybe, because what they incorporated in Civilization games eventually is stuff like espionage, although that's in a very limited fashion, which is sort of annoying to me. It's like never been really developed well in these types of games, but it's there. There's also, and that's much more developed in Civilization, culture gameplay and religious gameplay. So that you can even win the game, there are different victory conditions. You can win it in different ways than just exterminating everybody else, and therefore sort of winning by default. So you can have a victory that's religious, well, not strictly speaking religious victory, not in Civilization 5 at least, but basically like Civilization, the religious / cultural victory. You can have that sort of thing. You can have diplomatic victory, which was already basically in the Master of Orion 2 also. You could have become the president of the galaxy. You didn't actually have to kill everyone. So diplomacy is like one whole other mechanic that you can have in there. And because there's some bias on the side of the people who are creating the Civilization games in terms of like what's actually a good kind of civilization or victory, then even though you still have like mechanics like capitalist like trade / resource mechanics, you can't win the game as a capitalist or like in some sort of capitalist sense, like buying everybody else. You can win militarily, of course, because they can't not include that. But the other victories are also scientific. So it's like scientific, diplomatic, cultural victory. So their science was in some capacity always present in those games, because you can't really have a sci-fi game without research tree. That's also very important. So if I sum up, like when I say like 6x, so you have like diplomacy, culture, religion, science, military, resource-based game, and let's say like espionage game. So that's like the most. That's like the pinnacle of this kind of genre, these kinds of games. And most of those are an afterthought. So you have like 4 to 5 relatively solid ones, and then maybe like 2 thrown in a little bit. So they're not even or balanced as mechanics. So what I have devised, if you wanted to have like catchy titles, then I did actually develop a 12x system. Just show it to the cameras, but I guess I can then cut it in some way. So I did even come up with like the word names for each of the 12 ones, but what's more important is that those are 12 standalone equal game systems, is basically what that is. So you have your standard ones in there, so there will still be explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate as 4 out of the 12. But then you have the additional ones. So, and I did, of course, order it in like the system, which was sort of inspiration for it, obviously was inspired by astrological signs, or the whole system behind astrology in how you are developing ideal typologies of things. So that's like sort of the architecture of it is based on the sort of ancient kinds of mythological systems like this. But that's because they are very good at being holistic, meaning like that's a system in which you can represent all of the equal parts, is basically why it's inspired by that. So if you go like from what would be Aries to what would be Pisces, then like the first one would be Excel. So first X would be Excel, which is actually focused on leadership. And that's an element that's also in some of these games, that you have special leaders or heroes that like as in like individuals, like the place where you put them, like a colony where you put them to be in charge, or a military unit where you put them as a commander, gets bonuses based on the special unique qualities of the leaders that cannot be replicated through technology or just bought by more money or like done in any way through any of the other systems. That's just like the benefit you get from having the best individuals. So that's for like in sci-fi context, like some races could be like hive minds, so they wouldn't even be able to tap into this mechanic at all, because like for that you actually need individualism, like individual beings, to be able to reap the benefits of better leadership. That's like individual leadership, or we have to do it in a completely different way. The second one would be exploit. So it's basically focus on the material resources. There's a lot of stuff in the universe, and you try to control the stuff, have the stuff, and build more and more bigger and bigger piles of the stuff, so that you have stuff to make things from. So that by itself is hardly ever going to be like a victory condition by itself. Although you could try to make a victory condition, like if you hoard X amount of resources, you win. I guess you could do that, but in general, this is like supplementary to other goals that you actually try to accomplish in most of these games. Third one would be extend, which is based on the sign of Gemini. Is like the first air thingy. So that's about the communications, because like in those games, there's also an element, if you're exploring, sort of a counterpoint to exploring by itself, is that you're trying to map the whole universe and establish communications between all of the places in the universe, which is very important if you were making a realistic game. This is one of the very important things that's sort of under-focused on in the games, is that in order to be able to control armies at great distances, or just like control trade over great distances, establishing communication networks like is basically what you need to be able to even be able to fly far away from where you are and be able to do stuff there. In space is also more interesting because there's the communication lag. So like developing, for instance, like in this vein, the ultimate technology would be instant communications over any distance type stuff, because then basically you have a perfect network of real-time feed of information from everywhere at once.
The best example of that I've ever seen or read about was Orson Scott Card's Ansible from the Ender's Game series. That just kind of made a lot of sense when you try to think of anything, how at any point in the universe the atoms are connected through these phylodes or through some kind of galactic system that links us all. So it'd be awesome if we could figure something like that out, some kind of warp drive or on a molecular level that to communicate anywhere.
Yeah, and so in this
cool.
way, if you could really develop it into a substantial mechanic in a game of this kind, because trying to specifically reach that level of sensors and communications gives you a huge advantage, whatever you want to do otherwise in the game. Especially because if somebody tries to attack you and you know it a long time beforehand, then that gives you in strategy games time to prepare, and in real life time to prepare and adapt to whatever is going your way. So it's a very viable strategy by itself. Then I would put the expand there, and it's mapped onto what would be the sign of Cancer, which is all about in the game mechanics. That's about the expanding your basically living space, and with it mainly your population. Because one of the key mechanics in these games is population management. Because you can win very easily if you manage to grow a substantially larger population than everybody else in the game. So it's really about population management. But of course, there are requirements for increasing population, which requires you to colonize other planets and stuff. So you have to actually physically expand in the space, which then correlates with greater population that you can manage to raise. Then, of course, depending on what kind of species you are, and so you can play species which are more about like stronger individuals, but there's fewer of them, or you can play like a huge populations, but each individual is not as powerful. So it's more like a sort of a function of like a concentration versus sort of dissolution of what each individual can offer by itself, which can then in some situations be important. But also in about like healthcare and like, because population management is mostly about like medical technologies. So that's like also a kind of game where you would focus on, for instance, being better able to heal and recover all of your units in the game than everybody else. Then you have the Exterminate, which is here mapped onto what would be normally Leo, which is the good old, like, I will have a better army than everybody else, and I will defeat everybody else's army. So that's very straightforward and element that's present in most of the games in general. That this is like somewhat hard for people to imagine a game where you don't have this element at all. But importantly, in these kinds of strategies, you can go without it. Like, you don't have to play to exterminate at all. There could be ways through the other strategies to be basically impossible to damage you or attack you with an army. So in that case, you don't need to have a standing army necessarily to defend yourself, and especially if you're not aggressive or expansionist, then you don't have to feel the need to have a standing army necessarily if you can manage by other means to accomplish your goals. Then Exert, which is mapped onto what would be Virgo. Exert is based on work. So that's a production strategy. Usually one of the key strategies to win these kinds of games is to be able to outproduce everybody else. And it could be either in terms of quantity or in terms of quality. So either you're building better stuff or you're doing more work overall. And it could be some sort of like a trade-off or function between those. So that's a established game mechanic in many strategies of this genre already, even though it's not given specific name, and usually it's not thought of primarily as a path to victory by itself. Then mapped onto Libra, Exclaim. Exclaim is based on it's pretty much the diplomacy / culture, because I guess that's it makes some kind of sense to combine these things. So there could be like different ways in which you could try to go about this kind of approach, because this kind of approach is using persuasion, basically. Ideas. It's like try to have better, more attractive, more persuasive ideas than everybody else, so that other people, even though they could beat you up, decide not to do that because they agree with your better ideas or value you for being there to produce better ideas. Or this is the most pacifistic or peaceful or neutral approach that you can have in a game, which becomes very interesting if you have like many different players, especially like with a single player with NPCs where they could be reasoned with, because like if you're playing against living players, that may not be a possibility, even though you could roleplay, I guess. So if the other parties that exist in the universe are open to some kind of diplomacy, then or cultural exchange, which comes with it, then that could be very powerful. Then Expose, that's more the espionage strategy, which you could play as having like the best agents, like counter agents, meaning that nobody will be able to mess with you using spies. And that's just like being absolutely secure. It's like one way you could look at it as a gaming strategy to win. Or you could be the evil spy, and you could be the one who's sort of creating plots and framing people and like messing up everybody else's stuff secretly so that it can't be traced back to you, or stopped with even an impressively large army. Because that's one of the counters to something like an army would be, well, we could have just really good commandos like assassins, saboteurs, infiltrators and stuff, and so whatever other people have we can take away from them through infiltration, or turn it off, or make sure that they never know where we are so they won't be able to hit us, type stuff. So it's basically deception-based strategy, or like sort of anti-deception based strategy that you're either really good at, like being offensively or defensively a spy. This is what that is. And that's really not developed in many games at all, because like that, even if you think about it just for a little bit, and in some games there were some examples of it, you should have ability to do stuff like, okay, so I pretend that I'm sending an army that way, instead of just like whatever I'm doing that other people see definitely 100% is true when happening. So like the deception, it was, for instance, in Heroes of Might and Magic 3, or generally in the series, there was one of the like global world spells where you could create an illusion of having much larger army than you have, type stuff. So sort of like, if what you could in fantasy games do as illusion magic is also what like in sci-fi context you would do as like ways to deceive your opponents. I mean, of course, like just technologically empowered. Then Explore, which is mapped onto Sagittarius. Explore is, again, a key element of all of those games. Just like you take a ship, scout ships, and you physically scout the whole space. You go to places, and in those places where you go, you can like find stuff. So it's a bit of a treasure hunt strategy where you, like, or to put it more scientifically, like xenoarchaeology. That you're looking through various places where some advanced civilizations have left stuff, or just like it could be just caches of resources or whatever, and so you're getting stuff like that way, that you're finding it, looking for it. That's sort of a counterpoint to the extend strategy, because like it sort of makes sense, like as in astrology, opposite signs have a special relationship. So in this sense, like you could either build really good sensors and like James Webb Space Telescope type stuff, and just look everywhere using advanced science, maybe even faster than light or into the past and stuff, but not go there. Or you can explore in a way that you go there by ship, which is kind of slower, but then when you're there, you can actually do stuff at the place where you are. So both of these, if you sort of like manage to combine like opposite strategies like this, or complementary strategies like this, then like if you somehow combine the extend and the explore strategy, then you would be everywhere and also know where everything is. So it would be like, even if you don't have best ships and stuff, that would be very powerful.
I think it's really interesting to, with each of these, to try to have examples for what game does them best, right? Like we've already done a few. This one I think is probably closest with Star Trek. The whole explore the galaxy, being to boldly go where no man has gone before. So I think historically Star Trek and all these other ones kind of don't always jive that well, because it's never as much about the war. So, but trying to make Star Trek more about war is always a bit counterintuitive to the purpose of it, right? But lately they've done a lot of Star Trek games where it's focused just on the war, and it kind of loses its purpose of the whole explore and diplomatic relations thing type things a little more. Yeah, so I think that's interesting to kind of really zero it in and figure out how all these things could connect together into one game.
Well, exactly, because if you make a 12x system game, you should be able to replicate any science fiction scenario within the rules, because the rules are comprehensive. Meaning that any combination that's possible within the system should probably map onto a specific sci-fi franchise where they made those choices. So if you just made, you got a bit stuttery. So if you've just made a game where you could basically modify it, like select the scenario based on like sort of which sort of the mechanics are allowed or make sense in the universe and which don't, then you could create basically a game universe for basically the same kind of strategy game, where you could sort of replicate the conditions of any particular sci-fi universe, so that the way that it's being played strategically then logically becomes similar to the situation or scenario in that sci-fi universe. Because of course it's a big difference, for instance, if in the galaxy you have a network of stargates or not. Because if you have a network of stargates or warp gates in space, then you don't have to develop faster than light individual ships, meaning that much earlier in the technological evolution of the civilizations, you could have fleets of sublight ships being everywhere in the galaxy, doing sort of like conventional sublight battles. So these kinds of things, like you should be able, if you have this game system, you could be able to set up the system or modify it for the particular game, but it would still sort of be balanced and make sense. So yeah, like the explore one, especially if combined with diplomacy, is very much like the Star Trek scenario where that becomes important, meaning that it would be a universe where the species are generally open to diplomacy, meaning that you could feasibly, and there's a bunch of them, so you could feasibly build up a federation, because that's like a big thing that you would do to win the game as a diplomatic species, exactly. But you can have a space where there's some sort of like dark force that's attacking everyone who's being too public about stuff, and in like such a universe where this sort of setting, you can't do that because everybody would be paranoid and they wouldn't want to build themselves up into a target and then be attacked by like a Cthulhu or something.
Exactly. I think the key enemies, Spore had it. I don't know if you ever played Spore. It was another really good Galaxy one. There was a race to basically at the center of the galaxy that was always the enemy, and they were always antagonistic. But you had all the hundreds of other races that you could make diplomatic relations with. I think in Star Trek, the Borg is probably the best example. Anything that's just completely, they're just trying to assimilate you or kill you, one or the other, and they're not willing to, or they're not really interested in making deals with you in any shape or form.
Yeah, it's in the game design or game scenario sense, that would be just like if you were supposed to be able to make a federation and then face them, then you would just place them somewhere where they would be discovered eventually. Like in Star Trek, it's in the Delta Quadrant. So you can have like a whole starting quadrant or two in which you can build up the federation, and only later, because of limitations of space travel, you will discover the big threat, which has been there the whole time, but didn't know about you, you didn't know about it. So that also makes sense in sort of like building up sort of the arc of the game, or like the phases of the game. So that very much can be also incorporated. And then just to finish off the list, because of just two last X's, or three. The next one is exchange, which is based on the Capricorn. So that's basically your financial trading strategy. And in terms of gameplay, they very importantly would be responsible for supply lines, which is something that in real war, in conflicts, is super important, because it's very difficult. That was the whole premise of Voyager. It's like very difficult. Like, no, it doesn't matter how good the ship is, even if it has like replicators and stuff. If you throw it far beyond its supply lines, and it, like nothing can be easily replaced, and you always have to find it physically, then that's basically you're playing a survival game. At that point, you maybe don't want to play a survival game with your fleets if you send them to do stuff somewhere. So to safely have operations across space, they need to be connected with supply lines. And to have trade, you need to basically create a network of trade routes or trade lanes. So that's very much the meat and potatoes of this strategy. At which point then you can establish yourself as like the banker of the galaxy, and like other races could be borrowing money from you on interest and stuff, and that's how you're increasing your wealth and influence. And then you could, if you go dark side, you could like try to buy their governments and stuff, and essentially turn the galaxy into your oligarchy. So like you could just play like a Jabba the Hutt, or you can like try to be an entrepreneurial idealist capitalist, I guess, and you just use the more finance that you get through the trade and stuff and the various financial instruments to create big projects that that are maybe too ambitious for other species who don't necessarily have a trade empire. So you could maybe do like the equivalent, the space equivalent of the tallest building in the world type stuff. So maybe I guess this would be more on in the terms of if they make something of their own, this kind of strategy, like architecture wise, I think they may be like doing some sort of impressive mega structures. Because they have the capital.
Like a Dyson sphere or something like that, in intergalactic monuments.
Basically investing into mega projects. Like, because like the only other kind of approach that can get you to a mega structure would be the exploit one, which is able to hoard so many resources just on your own, like basically a mining strategy, that you would be able to do it. From everybody else, like the only one who might be able to get enough like investment capital to get such a project done would probably be the sort of exchange strategy. And then you have experiment, which is the scientific one, which was present in all of those games, but not named as part of the name of the games, which is a bit weird. Like if you look at like explore, expand, exploit, exterminate, there's like not really anywhere like in there mentioned that all of these games are pretty focused on research, without which you can't really, because that's not exactly exploring, because that's like sort of the difference between exploring and discovery. That you discover stuff, sure. So if the word discover had X in it, maybe it would be named after that. So this like the X thing is a gimmick, like the X names things is a gimmick that's not necessary. It's just technically I could create 12X. The final one, of course, with the research strategies, there sometimes are research-based victory conditions already in the games. Like basically research every technology that exists, and that allows you to start something up that makes you win. Like could be anything.
A new universe, a God universe, or a matrix of your own, some simulated reality or something.
Or anything. It could be like literally anything. You can like contact hyper advanced aliens and thus win the game, or just something like in the Beyond Earth game. You have like 3 different victories that are basically a version of research victory, because you just research a bunch of technologies and build a fancy thing, and then you win. Is a bit boring actually, so that maybe it should be some more interesting ways devised to win scientifically.
Something like curing aging, I think, should be a key part of that. You know, just becoming immortal essentially, or semi-immortal in some form. Where
well,
you're kind of
in some sci-fi settings, that could be just the beginning of being a space empire. That's maybe not ultimate enough, but it's one of the better technologies that you could come up with. Usually, it would be something that to win that fundamentally changes reality, or makes you learn something so fundamental about reality that nobody else can even touch you.
Yeah, you've got to be some kind of godlike being in some way, some kind of godlike technology. That's, you know, there's various kinds that make you all powerful, all knowing, all seeing.
Yeah, actually, I have a typology within the game's documents that I have written. I have a typology even of like different godlike victories, because like it means that you achieve sort of infinite control over some aspect of the universe. So it's a bit like Thanos and in Infinity Stones. It's just if you wanted to do it for real, then you could like maybe one of those is like you figure out time travel and you become a Time Lord, and thus control everything, everywhere, everyone. Or you find perpetuum mobile, so basically infinite source of energy. And as long as you have infinite source of energy, then everybody else is screwed. Or you unlock the doors of the multiverse, and suddenly you have an access to infinite universes with infinite resources. Or, as the fourth to complement this sort of this group, is you can become ascended. So you figure out life to such an extent that, like in Stargate, you become the ancients. Basically become ascended energy beings who know everything. So you could have fun with it. You can like sort of what you're researching, how you get there could be fundamentally different.
It's really interesting that you could have so many different victories, you know, where some of them lead to godlike existence and some of them just lead to conquering everyone, and you know, vices or whatever type you happen to enjoy, you can kind of go in so many different directions.
Yeah, you can try to be just very boringly the monkey with the biggest stick. It's just that you beat everybody else over the head with. Sure,
some people like that.
Some people will enjoy it thoroughly. In this case, I personally, my favorite in game, if it was realized, would probably be the time-based one, because what that then, like, I sort of also devised like for these particular victory paths and conditions. There's like as soon as they get into their late stage, it sort of trigger a galaxy-wide event that like you need to stop them or they're going to win type stuff. And I think I always try to think about it realistically. My favorite would be if it was like the Time War type stuff, and that was in Star Trek 2. There was a Time War in Enterprise, I think, in the series, and Temporal War. I forgot how Temporal Cold War type stuff. So what you then would do, like you would be able to stop, like at that point, the only way in which you would be effectively able to stop them is with really good spies. So basically, wouldn't like secret agents to sort of steal away their technology, or if they like also return back in time to win particular control over particular moments in time with your agents, so that, for instance, the race that was about to win never existed in the first place. And stuff like that. So basically using your espionage power, everybody will be using their pooled espionage power against the sort of ascending Time Lord empire to like at the last moment erase them from history.
Yeah, in Loki, it was really interesting how it was essentially one guy who created it, and he's immediately battling against millions of other versions of himself for, you know, the control of the single timeline, and you get all these variances to the timeline that essentially lead to another one of him creating time travel.
And what's fun, what I thought about also, is how in these kinds of games could be highly modular in that you set up the rules of the universe that you play the game in, including, okay, is multiverse allowed in this universe? Or is time travel allowed in this universe? And you can set it up so that the players don't know at the beginning of the game which of these things are actually possible or not. So that there's an element of like investing like highly risky research. You're investing into a potential victory condition, but it could be a dead end. And at some point you would find out if it's a dead end or not, and then you could move on something else. But it's sort of like also an element, like could be element of guessing, but I guess you could sort of build up the universe with clues in it. That like if you're savvy of either physics or of like sci-fi, then you might get an inkling earlier on than your researchers would tell you that it's impossible, that it might be impossible actually in this. So you have sort of events that suggest stuff. They could be especially like single player, carefully placed in. So that's like, again, more educational, that you can like really make people think about the science of it, which these games sadly are really not doing so far. So the final one, which again, in a few games, there's been something like this. It's just in Civilization games, they didn't really made it completely a victory path that it could have been easily. And that's so the last X is Exalt. So that's the religious path. And there you could, if you wanted to win that way, then you would be doing stuff like, okay, you can convert the populations of the whole galaxy to your faith. And thus, like, even though the rulers of the other empires, of course, don't believe your religion, if you reach some threshold, then you just become established as a de facto ruler of the galaxy, like something like the Catholic Church and medieval Europe type situation. So you turn the whole galaxy into some kind of holy empire. Or you could,
You know, that it kind of goes in line with a little bit of the culture wars, right? But yeah, that's an interesting concept that you could get one religion to rule them all, and in some form, instead of taking the scientific route and becoming a god, you're just kind of having the belief system that you've essentially got universal peace and universal harmony, universal happiness, because we all believe in the same deity.
Yeah, it's this gameplay mechanic, which is like, in some extent, that's the direction where they went in Civilization, that you could be spreading the faith to other empires and thus controlling some aspects of their bonuses that they have. But I think they didn't go far enough, because if you really went with it, like, and you can win this way. So it's like, if you like hold a certain percentage of the faithful in the galaxy for X amount of time, for instance, then you will become a de facto the Pope of the galaxy. And that's, even though everybody has the armies and the kings and stuff, that doesn't really matter, because they have to answer to you because the people believe in your faith, kind of stuff. You can really go far with it. And of course, you can have a military combination with it. You can have sort of a more like expansionist religion type stuff, like aggressively converting the unbelievers or eradicating the unbelievers if you wanted to go really dark. It could be a part of the game. You can have an Inquisition type stuff going on, because that's why the sort of religious gameplay is in flavor, is somewhere between the culture gameplay and the espionage gameplay, which is like makes it sort of its like interesting third way of like in like the context of you just doing open culture or you're doing just secret, probably pretty godless and nihilistic stuff like behind everybody's back. Because if you have faithful in somebody else's country, then you effectively have a kind of spy in there, like especially if they're fanatics. If like you sort of grow fanaticism, then they could be your assassins or saboteurs or basically do whatever.
One concept that's kind of missing from a lot of these types of games that I think is interesting, and it's kind of missing for a reason, but it's the concept that you as a leader are an actual living being in the game and could theoretically be killed or assassinated or died directly, or even possibly just age or you know, a natural cause. Because you're always kind of given this godlike status, especially in Civ games that last thousands of years. You're always this kind of godlike being leading things. So it would be kind of interesting to have at least an option where you are literally just a civilian, you know, a civilian leader of some kind in the game, and you're kind of vulnerable to the various kinds of things that normal people would be vulnerable to in the real world.
Yeah, there's a bunch of games that that do a version of this, and there's a whole subgenre of godlike games, where like Populous or Black and White, where you're playing a god. So there's a direct version of this that exists, a subgenre of strategy games on its own. But there's also they tried what you described, close to that, the one sci-fi strategy game, which is a bit of a deviation from how 4X games typically normally work, because it's more real time than turn based, and they made a bunch of different choices, and that's Stellaris. So that's an interesting experiment, probably of the newer sci-fi games of this kind. This the most interesting experiment, even though I don't think a lot of it works, because I think like sort of the issue is that they didn't use like a system like this one to know what they're doing the whole time. So they're sort of like figuring out elements as they go along, and some of them work, and oftentimes many of them don't. So with the sort of real leadership stuff, they try to be more realistic. And so if you like democracy and stuff, like there are a bunch of different regimes. They actually have like a holistic typology of regimes that you can run, which is interesting. And that's actually, I think, a good sort of development, and a kind of thing that I definitely will have in there, because just that just makes sense. So you can have like a holistic typology of possible regimes or types of economies. So they have a kind of pretty well, like from political science standpoint, pretty well realized. But so if you choose democracy or some other like normal like dictatorship, whatever, then there is a ruler who is a person with particular traits, and eventually they will die. So, or voted out of office. So if it's a democracy, there's a high turnover. So what it does is like you're switching in some like sort of time period. You're switching sort of the leadership bonus for your civilization. Is basically what it does mechanically, and it's not terrible. It's definitely an interesting way you can totally do that. In a sci-fi setting, however, you could also have effectively immortal rulers. Like you could be like, meaning like effectively like could be destroyed or changed if like through elections, but maybe they could be like biologically immortal because you can have the technology to not age. So they would have to be killed in combat. And so you can have them like placed in a particular palace on a particular planet or in a flagship. And if you destroy the palace or the flagship, like they could be destroyed, but they will not die like by aging. Or if it's an empire, they don't have to be voted out of office necessarily. Even though you could have like various events like coups and stuff that can sort of threaten to do that. But effectively, mechanically, what it means, if like, it could be an AI, it could be like the ruler, quote unquote, ruler, could be a bunch of different things. And many of them kind of immortal. And or like you can consider like who's like the hero on a galactic level, kind of has to be immortal for a reason, one reason or another. Like you can have still like in the galaxy, presumably many mortal leaders and stuff, but those would be like generic sort of no name, like there's a commander who has like the ship, the military unit has an EXP level. So it's like the unit has experience, and but it's like comprised of normal mortal people who just like maybe have to be like sort of have some sort of rotation in there. So you just can sort of imagine that that's how that works. So if you have somebody who's like a leader or a hero on a galactic level, maybe they have to be like, and it's basically an immortal AI or a cyborg or a genetically, biologically, or there's some sort of extra dimensional godlike being that infused them with power and stuff. Because that's what I wanted to get to, is like a more fun, even more fun way how to win religiously. Is like maybe you could summon your god into the physical space. Could be like a Lovecraftian type stuff, because in the sci-fi context, gods that are not like the best creator, top number one god, but like gods with how it was in Marvel with small g gods that like you could sort of work, because like you can do religion also through this astrological prism and basically create a pantheon of gods that like could be semi-real forces in the universe or beyond it, just something like Q in the Star Trek type stuff. They could exist, or the prophets. So
the Eternals in Marvel.
Or the Eternals. So there could be real beings of this sort that could be worshipped because they sort of are a manifestation of the principle that you're worshipping. And then maybe if you become like a really good example of like a belief in that principle, then you can attract the sort of being that's the highest manifestation of it to do something that you want it to do, or to give you a boon, or perform miracle, or just something like that. So instead of like the sci-fi setting, I think would actually work pretty well, because then like just what you get is again a different flavor of like the same mechanic that everybody needs to have, which is like you can have like more and more powerful units that you work with, or sort of cosmic powers, and it sort of doesn't matter if they're developed scientifically, like it's a science that you've researched and you're like Star Trek style. But even in Star Trek, then you can encounter, but there's also a Q continuum, and maybe if somebody's like like the diplomatic sense, because at Picard is what it represents, like a perfect sort of the Libra / like the sort of diplomatic hero type stuff, like in that sort of branch of game. So maybe there's such a like great diplomat, like such a great sort of hero character of this kind, that they attract personal attention of some sort of like omnipotent deity.
Very cool. Very awesome. I love it. Anything else? I've got a bunch of ideas I've kind of jotted down that we can kind of discuss.
Well,
Did you
sure.
try to wrap up? or anything else you want to wrap it up before I jump into my questions?
The questions you mean about what I've just talked about?
This. Yeah, exactly.
About
12x.
this. Okay, so yeah, that's basically just to sum up. So that's the 12x. The 12x, if you want to think of it simply, it's based on the zodiac, but that's for reasons like how the zodiac was constructed. So that's more of a like, if you know the signs of the zodiac, it's just a bit of a shortcut also to remember what the 12x are. They are developed in a similar way, but they're developed for a sci-fi universe. And you can take this philosophy that more broadly I call it the 12-fold path, which what it means is that you can apply this prism of like this sort of geometric system of philosophy, meaning you can apply it to different problems. And then you can sort of solve those problems in a philosophical sense, that in a sense that you will get a system that you can then work with and apply. So this is application of the zodiac system on gaming, if you really wanted to do that, which is somewhat more advanced, I believe, than similar systems that we are using in games so far, which is like 4x, which is just 4 of those components out of the 12 possible ones, which because the 4 are included in the 12 and the other 8 are equal to the 4. So there was just a 4 missing the other 8 is what that was. Or other even simpler stuff like in Mass Effect and many games, like you can be Paragon or you can be Renegade. So basically I'm Mr. Nice Guy or I'm Mr. Not Nice Guy. And those are my choices. And that's the prism through which I will finish the game, either in red color or in blue color. So this is somewhat in similar vein, somewhat more advanced.
Absolutely. It's I think the only reason this hasn't done before, this hasn't been successful before, let's just say, is because it's probably too complicated in the past for most people to even wrap their mind around that many different potential win conditions and potential paths. So, I mean, it's always like the paper, rock, scissors. It's easy to choose one of the 3, and this one beats that one most of the time. And the Zerg, Protoss, Terran kind of in StarCraft. It's another great, interesting dichotomy that explains the population and fast moving of the Zerg versus the technology and strength of the Protoss versus the utilitarianism of humans. So it's very easy to see things in groups of 2, 3, and 4. But when you try to expand it to 12, you've got so many more interactions, it's exponentially more interactions.
It's interesting that you say that, exactly, because that's precisely another advantage of this particular version of the system. Because, like I said before, in civilization-type games, we've already reached like the level of 5 or 6x out of the 12 that are the total number of things that can be done in the games. So it's not too complicated. Like the half of it is not too complicated, and that's a lot. Like already half of 12 is kind of a lot. But the number 12 is precisely the number for something like the zodiac, because the ancient sort of proto-mathematicians understood that the factors, the number of different factors, is what makes it useful. So the way you can divide it. In this sense, you can divide it by 6, by 4, by 3, and by 2 into subgroups, and you never need to focus on more than like 3 of the 12 at once. It just means that like you could do the 12 things, but if you try to do all the 12 things equally in a single game, you would just be not really good at any of them. So much like in real world, if you want to be successful, like if you have many options, you need to focus down or narrow down the number of things and become really good at them. It could be like you could try to be absolute specialist and just be best at one of them. Maybe that could make you win. But that's fragile strategy because you don't have nothing to fall back on, and there's not like sort of the bonuses that you get from combining things. So in this sense, if you're just playing it, you basically would be playing an empire where you pick 2 to 4 of the 12 and do some level of advancement in them.
Could you possibly have a tree that includes kind of all 12, almost like Path of Exile? I don't know if you know the skill tree from Diablo and Path of Exile. Path of Exile is every class shares the same skill tree, so they can kind of go in various directions and build their characters customized on how they want. Whereas Diablo, you're very kind of zoned in to your specific character that you choose. So this may be, you might have an option of whether or not you want to play in a world where you can literally do all 12 or do any parts of the 12 altogether, or you might want to have worlds where you kind of have to pick and choose 2 or 3 or 4.
Well, Zodiac is inherently geometric, meaning based on geometrical symmetries, which makes it very conducive to making these kinds of like branching trees typologies where the stuff is at various distances or angles from each other and visually makes sense still. So that's like the boon or benefit of the whole approach that the ancients chose, because it just made so much sense to create diagrams. Because that's the sort of ancient diagramming system. That's what that is. They were just pretty mysterious about it. So the only issue is, if you wanted to list every single thing that could be part of it or selected or whatever at once in one view, that'd sort of be pushing it in 2D. Meaning like you probably would have to have a 3D object at least. What that means is like the best way to view it is like you never show everything at once necessarily, unless you're making some sort of just crazy just to make your point, just like show the whole map type stuff. But you would always have some sort of like from any point you would be seeing sort of it's like through some sort of filter. It's a particular kind of related elements, meaning like the filters would be very important in visualizing it. In that you would have filters, and also it will be essentially hypertext, meaning that you will have particular windows that focus on some subset of the elements at one time that you need to concern yourself when you're solving one particular problem. Meaning like okay, I'm trying to develop technology to have better ships in battle. Then you don't have to show them the whole tech tree of everything and stuff. You just need to show them a view where relevant technologies to accomplishing that particular task is what they see at once. So you can definitely have, because that's the thing, showing, just, like in the Path of Exile, like there is a reason why they made it the way they did in that particular game, but it's not really necessary. Even if you assume that everything is connected, you don't necessarily need to have a view where you see absolutely everything at once. It's just that
makes sense.
My opinion.
I agree with that. I like that a lot. I just think it's very interesting to kind of have a starting point. So everybody starts when you start the game, you immediately choose maybe one of 3 or one of 12 right off the bat, where you kind of have a little tutorial that explains briefly what each of the 12 are about. Maybe you have 3 beginner suggestions for, try this one first, figure out what this is about first. So you choose, you make a choice at some point, and then it kind of starts you somewhere on some random world in the galaxy and teaches you about the mechanics of that particular choice you made. And,
yes, although you can do it, I think I would like to do, if we're actually going to make that game, I would like to make it like sort of single-player story campaigns, because that's my preferred way of learning mechanics of complex strategy game, like in StarCraft, where you particular, because like the 12, I have backstory races developed, the 12 fundamental races that form sort of the galactic continuum type society in the primary story galaxy of this universe, and each of them is like the paragon of the one thing. And that's why if you're like playing a campaign with some stories about them, then you're learning that element of the game, because like sort of the missions in the campaign for the particular race will teach you the basic stuff. Also, some of these 12 are more basic than others. Because like the sort of, it's not, I don't think it maps exactly on the 4X that are in the name of the genre, but some of the things to do in the game are more fundamental than others. Like the sort of that you have to explore, or that there are resources that you need to have. It's just sort of changes of like what you want to look for specifically, but you still have to look for something and accumulate something. So there, like the starting lessons are definitely about just how to go about, like how to look around, know what kinds of stuff there are, and some idea what kind of stuff you might need if you want to play a particular way, and to get it somehow, and then just build up your starting place, like to sort of to learn what kinds of things I can build, and then you should be able to expand from there. And the more complexities just begin when you discover another player race, meaning that I suddenly have to do some sort of diplomacy, but at first I didn't even translate their language, so it'd be very basic diplomacy, and then I get more and more into it, instead of like it was like a single player game or the tutorial type of game. So you would just establish more and more advanced contact. And so, okay, now we have culture. We're sharing culture. Or, they have spies. I should also have spies, probably. And so that's how you get to the sort of less needed ones. And some like the like religious gameplay. If nobody did it in the game at all, it wouldn't even, like nobody would necessarily notice. Meaning that like the game could be about it 100%. But some of those, if they were not present, they're not necessarily strictly needed in every game.
Right. So let me just rephrase what I heard a little bit. So I'm trying to envision this as a multiplayer game at all, and it's pretty tricky. So I think what you said there is probably the first version would focus almost possibly exclusively on single player mode, and that maybe future versions of the game, as it kind of evolved over time, maybe there would be some potential aspects that could be done in a multi-story competitive mode like Civilization or Masters of Orion. But I kind of see this as definitely much more of a story-oriented game, where it's one person exploring maybe a randomized galaxy in some form. And the interesting part with doing it as single player is you could have kind of the whole world making content for it, perhaps customized open source content for different paths or different races to interact with. And you can kind of have different rules for races and you know, basically have each race kind of follow their own version of the 12X and throw into some random planet in the galaxy. And you could say have some kind of database of thousands of different kind of made up races or created races with their own backstory, and kind of have them all populated kind of randomly throughout your single universe. And then you kind of just play through it at your own leisure. Maybe you die fast, maybe you don't. You know, maybe you die in the first hour and you start over and try again.
Yeah, that's like a lot of good stuff, and I have like million answers to like already thought of about a bunch of these things. So before I forget, like if you made it like a game, even if it's like sort of massive multiplayer online game, to some extent, it doesn't matter if like the other civilizations, other than the story ones, which like always they're probably in any version of the game, there would be the established galactic society somewhere. Or have some outpost somewhere. It's just if it was an MMO, it would be more like I like the term that I think Sagan coined, wilderness. That like always beyond your current reach of your civilization in other outside space, you can think of it as wilderness. Meaning that like there could be like new civilizations sprouting all the time in like the currently uncivilized, like in like the Rim in the Star Wars and stuff, like in the sort of less civilized areas. So in those, it's sort of, it doesn't matter if it's NPCs, like meaning like if it's a computer run other civilization or if it's another human run, I guess, except maybe in diplomacy. But in MMOs, people would be would want to do diplomacy as well. So that the sort of single player multiplayer problem, like a multiplayer of like a few people against each other, they will just want to destroy each other and not do diplomacy necessarily. So, but in MMO, it would work. It like how many players you have living once is sort of like it sort of adds complexity and an interest into it, but you can have like the galaxy sort of randomly, but nothing is random about the system, sort of populating the galaxy so that there's enough of everything, or all kinds of civilizations all the time, and just some of them could be maybe even like selected by players to play sometimes, meaning that you could even be shopping for like existing sort of NPC civilizations that are already out there and just pick one of them and run it for a while. Like you could be just doing that sort of the approach of like it's good if you have living players, but you don't strictly need in that sort of type of game to have living players. It's just like they would be taking what's run by AI as avatar if they want to. So AI would be very important, but also you dying might not be that big of a deal because there could be many inbuilt mechanisms how you can resurrect civilizations, because like there's like a whole sort of it's maybe even Isaac Arthur had some sort of episode about it at some point, but something like there's one of the races of the galactic continuum is like the religious race of the galactic continuum, which is like running the galactic religion. One of the things that they want to do or like to do is bringing dead civilizations back to life. So basically resurrection, because like you can sort of technologically, if you also have some sort of like cultural understanding, you could try to do that. So if something wipes you out, then like some sort of like benevolent UFOs can come to the planet and just start it up back again. And after some period of time, the civilization is back to its basically starting point. It's just with some differences. It's just not going to be exactly the same. Or you can do it yourself. You can build fail-safes yourself that will sprout your civilization back into existence if you want to have more control over it.
I like that. So theoretically, if it were to work as an MMO, you would basically have your own starting solar system that wouldn't be touched by anyone else for a certain period. It'd give you whatever, 10 minutes, an hour, 2 hours to kind of establish and figure out what you wanted your race to be like, perhaps. And then at that point, kind of when you're ready, you kind of open up you click a button and say, I'm open to PvP now, or I'm open to diplomatic relations, right? And at that point, it kind of slaps your solar system or your set of solar systems into the bigger.
You can make it make sense in story, in that you have to kind of sort of wave at others for them to be able to find you in space, because it'd be unless you want to be found in space, it could be kind of difficult to be found by anybody who would consider you interesting immediately, so that they would send up, because the ultimately most advanced races would maybe be able to see that you're there, but they wouldn't necessarily care because you don't really have, compared to their other problems, it's just not really worth their time.
Yeah, the other major challenge there is if certain races, perhaps like the scientific godlike races, get too strong at any point, and they basically just annihilate everyone else in the PvP universe, it gets boring for everyone else really fast, right? So you have to have some kind of, arbitrary limits as to how strong someone can get, and make it so that other people could always team up against them and beat them down in peg or something.
Or
right?
like I have thought of several solutions to these kinds of problems. One of them is you can think of it as game eras. In many of these kinds of games, like I've played like Czech games like O Game or Web Game, which are basically not necessarily O Game is sci-fi in space, but Web Game is just our current politics on Earth. But what it does is that you have sort of game sessions that end up with somebody winning. And so in this kind of space, it doesn't necessarily have to be like, or at least one particular playthrough could be like, there will be some sort of, based on how you set up the game systems. It will take some time for anybody to achieve any ultimate victory condition, while everybody else knows what everybody else needs to do that, so they will try to prevent that from happening, or just people who try to accomplish it all for themselves, neutralizing each other so that at least none of them does so. So you can calculate then like how long it will probably take for the universe to exist until it implodes in some sort of cataclysmic event, which then is like fun as like an event thing. And then basically everything at some point resets, because like even in most of the science fiction stories, you hit a reset button eventually in some way, shape, or form after an ultimate apocalypse happens.
One thing you could do perhaps is you have your kind of starting race or background story or development path, and then you kind of hit save at a point where you want to make it PvP, right? And you can always kind of go back to that point, and maybe there's 100 different choices for PvP realms, some with 5 people, some with 50, some with 1,000, and they're all kind of at different technological levels perhaps. Maybe there's some kind of numbering scheme where you can say how far advanced they are, how strong they are. And you kind of just pick and choose where you want to go. Maybe you want to try an advanced 1,000-person realm with your little solar system and see if you can make some deals with people and make trades to get more science or something. Or maybe you just want to try against 5 other people who are just starting, just clicking PvP at the same time as you and just trying it, right?
That's easy. That's perfectly quantifiable. Because in order for this system to work as a game system, the one thing it has to be is perfectly quantifiable. Because it's nice to have I would like to have ideas. Like I would have a good espionage in there, but everything has to be calculated into points. Meaning that one of the benefits why I'm doing it this way, why I'm using particularly the zodiac as a template, is that in numerology, which it is based on, regardless of what you think about it specifically applying to the real world, if you think about it as a mathematical tool, what it allows you is to calculate qualitative things with some sort of objective number representation. Meaning that, and also have the symmetries, which sort of tell you ratios of stuff. So you can sort of figure out or easily combine what's sounds very qualitative with just the pure computing, pure mathematics. Meaning that if you're doing research and you want to win by research, it has to be equivalent in some number of calculable points to how much stuff you would need to do and get or time to pass for other kind of victory. So something that's qualitatively very different, like defeating everyone militarily. So it all sort of starts from you have a time and how much, for instance, resources you accumulate per time, or how long it takes to build a thing. And it's all in number of turns, or just game steps. Could be even a real-time sort of situation. Or you need a certain amount of points or something, which is calculable, and you need to make it so that to accomplish equivalent things, which in this system, in sort of zodiac-like system, you can identify which things are equivalent qualitatively. So you have to just then make sure that everything that's equivalent, different qualitatively, but basically giving you the same amount of ability to do stuff or win, has to cost the same amount of points of a specific resource, which could be different resources. But then you are just you have to calculate the rate at which those resources can be gathered has to be commensurate with the cost to accomplish a particular equivalent thing. To give you an example, it costs a certain number of research points to research anything. And there's some element of chance in there, because I like the model which was in Master of Orion 2, where you had, after a certain amount of turns that you had to research a particular thing or spending a certain amount of points, and you had a chance that from that point on, certain level of chance each turn that you will actually discover the technology. So
Yep.
it added a bit of randomness at the end there. So in some strategies, you can add a bit of randomness. But ultimately, like let's say like to win a game by researching pretty much everything or the whole pathway and to then do stuff, it will take X amount of turns as long as you have a production of X amount of research points. Then if
Yep.
you want to win militarily, maybe what you would need to do is like an ultimate capital ship type stuff or a particular fleet of ships, which will cost you a certain amount of resources that you need time to mine, and you need to time to build them and time to move from where you are to where the enemy is. So that whole thing should be calculated at roughly the equivalent amount of points overall. Or if something that looks very different, but ultimately would cost about the same amount of time and resources, just maybe of a different kind, is like, okay, so you want to win as a spy. You need to do that. You need to train like such an elite infiltrator spy that they will be able to pose as, I don't know, the president or ruler of the other civilization and then like swap them, for instance. So you will have to
Right.
train them for a very long time and spend about as much money if you were building the capital ship just to be
Right.
able to do everything that you need to get them in place, like including like bribes or doing spy operations to gain enough intel to be able to unlock like the higher level of operations. So in this system, yes, everything from religion to just material stuff, everything can be calculated into points. Each of these 12 paths have their own specific resource, like that's points of resource. Like you can have points of culture or points of faith, and so that's even in civilization games already. So everything like that, that's the benefit of like doing it this way. Is just the system is compatible with mathematics and at the same time with the flavorful, colorful, qualitative ideas.
I love it. I love it. So conceptually, we're talking about 12 different kinds of currency or slash resources, essentially. And it kind of tracks each of those things, where money would be maybe the trade one. And each one is very different. Maybe maybe there's parts along the way where you convert one to another type of currency, perhaps,
With
if you
loss.
want to change your path. Yeah, with a little bit of loss, obviously. I like that a lot. Again, yeah, it's tough when you have 12, but I really like the concept that you only really need 2 or 3 different currencies at any given game to make progress. And then so then it's easy to tell exactly how much total currency you have of all 12, and each currency has to be relatively close. You know, 1 unit of this is relatively close to 1 unit
Just
of that.
what it means is, if you think about it as currencies, is that each of these currencies like can buy its kind of thing for a huge discount, but
Right.
everything else much more expensively. So, for instance, with faith, the easiest thing you can do with it is advance your religion, because like you're sort of unlocking the new tenets of the religion, making it more appealing to everybody, or interesting or powerful.
Yeah.
But if you wanted to buy, for instance, food or soldiers for it, there should be ways how to do it. It's just it should be easier to grow the food, under like all other things being equal, or like it should be easier to hire mercenaries for money, probably, than
Yeah.
for faith.
You could actually have a really good exchange rate for each, from every currency to another currency, based on how close it is or how similar it is to your currency, right? Um, I think that'd be pretty simple to do, and just kind of have it there that people just realize, oh, that's going to cost me 30% more resources of this, but I'll at least be able to get that one thing that I want from that other X. So I like that a lot. And so the end goal is, so you basically start as a solo player for however long, 10 minutes, hour, 2 hours, and you get to a certain level of turns, where it basically you have so many resources. So now you can kind of choose any single PvP world you want, where everyone is starting with a similar amount of resources, and you're all kind of starting in a
Yeah,
similar spot. So it's
like
relatively fair.
equivalent of like level. You can classify, come
Level,
up with
yeah.
some sort of, because what I like is naming everything within the game using something that works in story in the universe. It's just like to not break immersion. And so, okay, let's come up with a classification system for advancement of civilizations. That's much more.
Yeah.
That's better than just Kardashev, just like 0, 1, 2. Just like, yeah, we
0,
need
1, 2.
scale. And so, but that
It's got
already,
one.
like Isaac Arthur has actually already explained how to do that. So you can have a pick those like 0, 1, 2 like as like points on a scale, and then fill in the in between points. So you
Right.
can say like this civilization is like 0.3 Kardashev.
Yeah, I love it. That's great. I love the math. I love the way it can be programmed. I love the potential for single player stories that are infinitely customizable, infinitely expandable, infinitely open source that it could open up to everybody in the world to just build their own campaigns.
Yeah, but I wanted to say that's very interesting to me now that you said it, because my main problem if I was making games would be that I made all the content, so it would be boring to me. But if you make it modifiable infinitely in the open source way, or just like it's called just like modding, if you allow modding in this
you're
sense.
just adding civilizations, or adding
so then I could play it. I could play scenarios that I didn't create, and I can have fun with the game. So I guess I would selfishly be very much in support of that.
Yeah, I love the potential for that, for sure. Possibly now, as far as how to finance it, again, whether you'd want to do it open source, or whether you want to sell it to someone like Sid Meier, or whether you want to maybe sell expansions or sell content, sell stories to some extent, where you kind of give everybody the base mechanics and they can mod it as much as they want. But if you want the cultural story or graphics, maybe, or you could sell cinematics to go with the story to some extent.
That's very much the model of Stellaris. They're selling data disks, like expansions of game mechanics and story. I mean, they don't really have that much story in there, which is a bit of a shame. Even though that's one of the harder things to incorporate properly in such a system. But they're adding a whole bunch of new game mechanics and stuff in expansions, and the expansions are pretty expensive. Like each expansion costs almost as much as the new game, pretty much. So I'm pretty sure they're making quite enough money on that. But yeah, that is definitely a model. You can just be continuously building expansions to whatever it is, because that's the thing. The system, as it is devised, is effectively infinite. It just like sort of explains the outer limits of what you can do, how many things you can add into the game. Nothing's stopping you from creating just a subset of it. Like it's like 12x system, but you can start with the game that just has the 4 basic ones. It's just with the understanding that there's room to expand and complexity to be added, because you already know how exactly to add any of the other things into the system.
Yeah, I really like the challenge of finding a good balance, right? It's always about finding the balance between all 12 of these as to which path gives me the highest chance of victory. Well, they all can. They all are a relatively simple, relatively similar chance of victory, no matter which path you choose. Some might just have a little more story or a little less, complicated things to go with, but you essentially have a similar, if not equal, chance of victory going up against anyone else who chooses any of the other 12. You have your pass, and it's kind of like with any game. If you look at League of Legends, it's a great example of balance. They've got 150 different characters, or more now probably, and they're constantly tweaking them, trying to say, oh, this guy's too strong, he's got 4 abilities, we've got to tweak this ability a little bit. So you could do something similar with these 12 X's, where you're constantly tweaking how much a certain thing costs. This particular path is a little too strong. We're going to tweak the cost a little bit and make it a little more or a little less. So
the balancing is definitely a key component of creating a strategy game of this kind and complexity. What you need is a system that is balanceable. So it's like in the mathematical sense. That's why I'm specifically devising it to be balanceable, even though, of course, I acknowledge the balancing it will be work that somebody will have to do, probably me in large part. But yeah, sure. Or the modders, like you can, like people who mod it can like help you with the balancing it eventually as like sort of beta testers. So that's definitely doable. It's just what's like sort of more of a challenge, because like you can come up always with the balanceable mathematical system. I think like what's sort of the added value of this particular approach is that it's also a way how to help you devise the qualitative explanations for everything. Because like everything in the system you can represent mathematically or geometrically, which is essentially mathematically. But it's sort of, when I just started, I guess I can share screen with you to show you, because I already have it on my website. It's sort of like a work in progress thing. I'm not sure if you've looked at it, but I guess for the purposes of here, I will show it in the video as well. First of all, what I'm creating it in is the draw.io. So this is basically the system awesome. That I'm creating it like as a huge interactive fractal diagram here, and but I can also show you. I have it on my website, so it's like embedded HTML. But I will have to update it, I guess. So we can even use it here, and what it does is like everything that's already sort of filled in as a category. Not everything is. Most things have at least something in them. So if I like, for instance, like want to look at like the religion gameplay, just click it, and then. It's like a diagram, and you can then like there's also descriptions, like basic descriptions of what that cell represents. but you can go deeper. And there's well, not in this case because it's a final level for now. But what's not
But
final?
you could go as deep as possible with each of these things.
Yeah. You can. That's the way I'm developing. I'm going deeper and deeper. Like here, conversion, for instance, religious conversion. And so there's like a diagram of a basically religious conversion. Usually, what this shows you, not the exact math yet at this point. That's on the lowest level that you will work through. Like
Right.
in a particular math in a particular game. But this sort of shows you like what are the elements and what are the relationship between the elements in that game mechanic. So like which units would make sense to include, like what kind of actions, like if you're converting, like what are you using to convert people? It's like, yeah, we can do a crusade on people or build works or share gospels or somehow cause miracles. And those would be things that would convert other people from other civilizations. And then, like, it's not there yet, but I could make a lower level of, like, okay, so what's the typology of miracles that could be in the game?
Yeah, and it just keeps going deeper. That is amazing, Martin. That's really good. I like
So that's basically, I think, if anything is like the biggest contribution on the whole thing, I think it's just this concept of doing diagrams itself, because I had to sort of invent that to be able to do it, which is sort of a logical conclusion of you're trying to do the zodiac-like diagramming. This is what you get. So I guess it's holistic. It's always a circular design, basically. But the hexes are good because the hexes are very easy to modify and manipulate in like sort of a puzzle-like fashion. So what's great about it is just if you're using this system and you try to come up, okay, so what need to be the elements of this mechanic? You start by putting in what you already have figured out, so what you've already thought of. But and you put it like, okay, so something has to be in the first place always, so that's arbitrary. So something's first. Okay, so is there something that's opposite to that? And if I have two opposite things, is there like a whole scale that's opposite to this scale? So you add the stuff. So it sort of immediately creates, and you can select like a diagrams composed of 3 elements or 4 or 2 or 6 or 12 or even 7, whatever you want with the number of hexes. Like it doesn't even have to follow just the symmetries divisible by 12 if you want to. You can just put the hexes in any configuration that you want that represents any roughly geometric relation or object. But then what it does is basically you've turned the inventing of your game system into a puzzle game. And so just by placing something in there, it hints at you what you're still missing. And so you're filling the gaps that you create by placing in there what you already know. And just by following the basic rules like what's like opposite to each other in a symmetrical shape needs to be qualitatively opposite. What's next to each other is adjacent, meaning like it's like if it's a circle, then those are steps in a cycle. So what's the next step in the cycle? What's the next step in the cycle until it returns to the first step? So you use any kind of geometric relation and you decide for yourself, okay, this diagram has this symmetry, and then you just fill in the parts and it will make holistic sense if you know logic, if you know how to do logic.
If something is the same, if you go deeper and you have the same hex in one one lower level as a hex in another lower level, would they be connected or would they be completely separate?
Well, you could decide to complicate it for yourself and create a hyper object. Like you can, like if you're doing the basic version of it, then you're trying to always have a unique thing. Like it could have like a similar name or the same-ish name, but each of those hexes basically in my diagrams, like as they are now, and it's like a many pages of diagrams, each of them represents a unique thing.
Right. That makes sense. When you try to interconnect them, it gets a little too many circles. There's too many circular loops. So I like the idea of keeping them separate instances.
Sure, there should be a solution to it. If you're a good enough mathematician or logician, you can come up with even like hyper geometries. Like you can do that, because just what it is like what it sort of strongly hints at me is that if you want to crack meaning as a concept, like qualia, qualitative phenomena as a concept in a way that's mathematical, the way to go at it is through geometry.
Right.
So maybe this could even lead to something like more fundamental understanding of something. Like this is even something maybe you could build physics on. I don't know.
Maybe. So from a game perspective, again, trying to wrap my head around how this would actually play out. So whether you have graphics or not, let's not worry too much about graphics because you can always add that later. But from a perspective of someone sitting down starting a game, they would see the first dichotomy pop up in some fashion, and they have to make a choice. They have to choose a hex. essentially? What kind of ruler would you like to be? It's kind of like some of those. I think Ogre Battle was one of the interesting ones where you answered 12 questions. What type of ruler would you want to be? And it kind of gave you statistics and a game design based on that style of
that was in Morrowind. You were selecting your astrological sign by answering a series of questions.
Yeah,
or class.
Similar. Yeah, so I think that's probably a decent idea to start with, is just asking interesting questions and then maybe making a suggestion. You kind of fit under this hex, and so we'll give you 10 of these bucks, 10 of these exploit bucks, and 10 of these exploit bucks, because that's where your questions kind of led you. And then it's up to you on where to spend them. So now you say you can spend them on this hex or that hex. Whether you start.
Yeah, that's because that's the thing. In this sense, if you have these hexes as based on the zodiac type stuff, the system based roughly on the zodiac, that's also a psychological personality inventory type system at the same time. So you absolutely could create leading questions or questions that sort of try to inquire into the personality of the person who plays the game, which then would suggest stuff to them based on what they probably would like. So that's a sort of also a benefit. It doubles down as a personality thing, which again, I have to guess full disclosure, even at the very beginning, I think you could pull off some sort of Westworld stuff with this. I'm not sure how long you've seen the new show, to what point.
I think I just watched 2 seasons. I haven't seen the new one.
So there was this whole thing that sort of spoiler alert, Westworld had a point. It was a research experiment, and the hats, the white hats and the black hats of the cowboys were reading brainwaves. And so the people making choices in the game were also feeding data to the corporation about their behavior type stuff.
Training the AI by kind of mapping human decisions.
Yeah, they tried to, again, super spoilers, they tried to replicate human mind, meaning artificially. So that's of course obviously sci-fi, and it doesn't explain specifically how to get there with anything. If you use this kind of system, then by the choices in the game, you could make assumptions about the personalities of the people. Right. Because if they like this particular kind of game strategy, it also corresponds in the system with a particular astrological configuration of personality. Because they've basically selected the number of signs in particular configuration, is what they did by playing. Right.
And I could see that being very interesting to replay with different styles. Everybody always wants to try to play a game as many different ways as possible, typically, to understand all the different stories and possibilities. So they kind of come in with a different perspective. Last time I tried conquering, now let's try religion. And they try to answer the questions in different ways to try to get the starting bucks in a different amount. And there might be 1,000 different ways, combinations to answer the 10 or 12 starting questions.
That's a challenge, though. That's a practical game development challenge, because you can devise this system relatively easily once you know how, and develop it to any complexity. The issue is that then the more you increase the complexity of conversation answers, the more you're increasing the complexity of stuff that you will need to develop, like the number of things you will need to write, especially. So at that point, you probably, to fully exploit the sort of potential of the system, you would need to have AIs, like storytelling AIs and stuff. So that's the far of future thing. If this whole approach actually can sort of bridge mathematics with storytelling in some sort of important, qualitative, meaningful sense, then maybe it's also a pathway to developing a storytelling AI, meaning it's it would understand the structure of the story, and it will learn on the various kinds of stories that are coded by this is this kind of quality, this is this kind of quality, to sort of be then able to improvise something meaningful. Is, I think, something you could be able to get at through this geometric approach.
That's really interesting. So you could maybe try to use some of these new open source text conversational AIs in some way to kind of create stories for this game as you go. So every single time you play through the game, it might be a random different AI giving you the storyline. So it's a completely different game every single time.
It's just what really matters is the structure in which you will teach them. Because you need to use this sort of architecture of different meaningful states that can also be mapped to game states. So it sort of doubles down in this count. And then you will have to learn from examples of stories, basically need to understand the architecture of stories. Meaning that it can get a specific word choices wrong, but you can always excuse it, again, in story. In a sci-fi universe, that's just not a perfect translation of an alien language. So you can sort of find cheat explanations for the flaws. But basically what it needs to do is to become able to understand like the kinds of storytelling that's like the ancient pantheon mythology, and so that it
Right.
understands like what are the roles that an actor can play in a context, and what are kinds of contexts that exist. So like to understand like oh, so this is about overcoming fear, and so it will give you these 4 choices, which basically are the symmetrical different kind of choices. If you select 4, these will be the 4 qualitatively most different options that you can get. And in this context, this would make sense. Like with the fear, the only things that make sense to choose from are I will like face the fear, I will run away, I am paralyzed, or it's some other thing. So I think you can, if you have this mathematical structure and it's sort of woven into the learning materials, or that's like how you sort of set it up to understand things, then I think it might be able to learn to be able to generate something that would make sense. Even then, and when you do that, then you can have the game infinitely large and complex, because
Interesting.
just the example they used it in Skyrim in one of the mods. They used AI to take snippets of like individual words of all the conversations of all the NPCs and recombine them into new voiceover. Meaning that they like wrote the new lines from the existing words that the voice actors have spoken, and so that they rewritten, so they have a list of like the words that they are totally available that are voiced, and the AI then like stitched it together convincingly that you can have like with the same voice actors, you can have a whole set of new dubbed conversations.
Interesting. Do you see vices like, drug use, alcohol, let's just, or even like lust or pornographic type things ever being a part of a game like this? Or is that kind of too something we'd want to kind of keep as the dark side? If people want to mod it on their own, fine, but it's nothing we would ever want to do on our own.
Well, I'm a European, so I am a bit decadent and too liberal for American taste. So I guess my threshold is definitely further than a North American threshold on these issues. But of course, like just for legal reasons, there's some hard limit at which you have to stop, beyond which people even doing the mods on their own would be basically criminal activity. But within what's basically legal, then like the question is, do you want to get in like North America a specific kind of rating that will make it harder for a specific age group to play it? So I guess you don't have to be a complete edgelord and push it by yourself, like especially as long as you know that modders will create everything that's missing anyway for somebody who really wants it. But in terms of things like drugs and stuff, I think that wouldn't be an issue in these kinds of games. Like I have seen sci-fi games where like smuggling drugs was basically a thing you could do. It's just, I think, for educational purposes or like moral purposes, if you want to be educational and moral about it, which the game by itself is so based on classical mythology that it's basically teaching character stuff. That's also inherent in it. So you just need to frame it in a way that makes sense, meaning like, oh, that's an illegal activity, that you're risking some sort of harm that would happen, so that you, even if you do it, you sort of learn through doing it the downsides of doing it.
Makes sense. So you could kind of have it as an option to try to control people through vices, for example, or control people through this kind of vice.
Especially the spy strategy should have the option to go dark side, because that's like sort of important teachable moment about intelligence agencies as such.
Yeah, you control people through the exotic drugs and things like that in some cases, because that happens in the real world. Obviously, it's one of the scariest, darkest parts of the real world is the slavery beyond of the drug trade. But I think
I guess
really important.
In the context of game, you can do slavery as a negative thing that the worst actors are doing that you can then fight against most of the time, like as a good guy. It's just you probably can't go too much into detail of slavery, meaning like the different certain kinds of slavery would be very much bordering on illegal, even if just being depicted. So definitely you can have, but that's also in line with the whole philosophy of the system. You can go as detailed or not detailed as you like on any of those particulars of the game mechanics.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it makes sense to at least try to start it as a somewhat PG rating. You don't want to get too many Grand Theft Auto ideas in there off the start anyway. And down the road, people could, then if it was open source, they could mod it however they wanted and do it their own way. But I think if you can kind of keep it PG and educational, that's definitely a little more mainstream as far as getting it accepted anyway.
Also it runs into practicalities of game development, because you don't have infinite time, you can't develop everything, so you, in any case, you sort of sort the possible things to add in order of their importance or being core to the gameplay, and any first core version of stuff that you create can't possibly include like the most fringe external darkest elements, because those are not essential, like nowhere near core elements to the game. So
Right.
the core game will definitely just include the core stuff, and the first game, or any kind of first game, might even be more limited in scope, like what we're thinking about with the rest of my co-developers, my roommates, is that you might want to start maybe just on a planet, like the Beyond Earth scenario. Meaning like you just have an alien generator of alien planets, and you're managing a colony on planet. Maybe you could start that way and be very story driven, to sort of like more like a StarCraft type of stuff, where you like get people invested into the story of the universe, or like Arcane has managed to do, like what they did just with the flavor. Like they developed flavor for the characters, which wasn't needed strictly speaking, but that's what then they turned into the best animated show or best game adaptation of in history, and like created their sort of made their whole universe, like the whole game, way more interesting than it was before to even people who would never play it. So this is the kind of thing that if you do this right, like sort of establish the story right, then you can do books and movies and like whatever you want. Like the sort of if you want to be very cynical about it, much more merchandising that you can like as like a revenue stream, or like any, because I don't necessarily have much problem with that. Like if I have a problem, is like if you add too many transactions into the game. But like if it's stuff around the game, that's like fan stuff around the game, then it's like, sure, people want it, so you do it for them, and there's no like harm in that.
Okay. So you'd have to kind of pick a core, I guess one race for each thing, maybe that's your core NPC, race essentially. And you would kind of choose any combination of those, for any single playthrough, and you kind of build on the qualities of that particular NPC. So you kind of have to have the general storyline for each of them, and then kind of merge them all together in some kind of random way, I guess. So you play through it.
Random, I don't like the word random, but that's in a strictly mathematical sense. Randomness is implying meaninglessness, and this whole system, while can be like random-like or semi-random, it's and could be generated in that way. It doesn't have to be exactly the same every time. It's like in Diablo-like games where you create basically the same dungeon with the same kinds of things in it, but it's in details, in the specific places or details of places. It's always a bit different. So that's a good approach. So in this sense, you definitely want to semi-randomly generate the map, but importantly, it will always have all of the important elements in it at particular distances, relative distances, and in relatively corresponding quantities at relatively corresponding times in the game. So there's a balancing equation. It's like basically what you have is a balancing equation of elements, and it's just like there are multiple different solutions to it, so multiple different ways to set it up, but which you can sort of mathematically prove that are equivalent, again, in terms of point distribution and distances stuff and time stuff.
That's great. Well, I'm sold. I'm ready to buy it. What can I do to help? Do you want me to get involved in a bigger way, or are you still kind of just keeping it in-house for now?
I'm not keeping the system in-house because I think the whole system has value far beyond the game, and even if we didn't actually get to make a game, I think I will try to sell, quote unquote, at least open source, spread the system, because I think it's very useful. So in that sense, you're already participating because I like sort of getting feedback, and you definitely in this capacity are helping me to spread the word about it. So that's definitely something like that you can do. It's not because we don't have a testable game to play. We've already made our first game, as I've mentioned, which is sort of unrelated to this, was just a proof of concept that we can make a game. And I don't think it wasn't terrible. It was the UFOs gathering the cowbells because aliens stole all the cows. It's a silly thing. But sort of already made a game, and for which I've made the music. So I think we can do it. My two roommates are currently programmers. One of them is currently employed. One of them will soon have to find a job again. But probably won't be any problem for him. I was like a senior programmer who just like taking time off because he could. So to develop again, he has to finish. He has a game in development. which is called Pebbles, which might be an acronym for something. I'm not sure right now. It's an arcade game where you have some sort of like a variations on like a 2D arena in which you're running around as like a sticky figure and throwing various like differently colored attacks at each other. And it will have already has a bunch of mods like a volleyball mod and like sort of like silly stuff like that. So also a very different kind of game, but that's basically what he was doing for the last couple of years to sort of learn how to do games. Was in Game Maker developing, so he's also approaching sort of releasing that. So before he releases that, I don't think we will like start 100% on it, even though we have already started development of some of those like planet generation, tile generation stuff. So like game maps. So we've started doing some stuff like that and narrowed down like some of the mechanics to a higher level of detail than I've discussed with the examples that I've used. So we're approaching the mathematics of it all, and in some of the places. So if you want to help, like whenever there is something that we produce, we definitely can look at it and like test it or whatever if you want. That's for sure what you can do, and like share it with your friends or like tell anybody else about it. For now, I think what I will need to do is develop at least some sort of like a story-based thing in it. So at least like a actually like fully formed story from that universe and stuff in some form. I have some short stories from the universe, like sort of experimental, on my blog on medium.com. So there's technically I also, apart from my Words of Tomorrow publication, I have also the Masters of the Future. It's like the sort of code name of that project. So Masters of the Future publication, in which the existing short stories and poems that I've already written are in there. And some of them I think that because this also conceptually, the stories should work also in universe as like entries in some sort of Encyclopedia Galactica, or they should, because that's kind of like how you do this sort of world building storytelling from some of the classical science fiction works, or game manuals for game mechanics that are disguised as stories in the game, which they do, for instance, in the Elder Scrolls games. You have a bunch of books that are some funny stories, but also kind of explain the game mechanic, like what you can try to do in the game in the story form. So there's like one of them is, for instance, like a planetary invasion guide for dummies. It's like one of them, and it's like what like in universe, one of these sort of military races, the main military race, sort of like one of their heroes is like writing a manual for the not super intelligent members of his species on how to do particular military things in the universe. It's like could be like an ongoing series. I think he's already wrote like 2 short stories from his like a guide for dummies. And so he's sort of explaining like how you can epically fail at invading a planet, which basically gives you some advice if you were playing the game in its more fleshed out form, like what you maybe should try to check for before you do a planetary invasion, or how you should think about it. It's like, okay, so you like approached the planet with your fleet and just bombed it into oblivion with like nuclear bombs. Like, congratulations, you can't land on the planet or do anything useful there. So it's like you actually have to think about like why would you even do it, or how you would make sense to do it, or what are the kinds of things you may want to gain from it. So you can definitely check out those stories if you want, and read them, because some of them also explain something about the game mechanics in an indirect way that I thought of. And also, like I said, on my website, the system as I'm developing it is in HTML clickable form, is on my website in like my section of my projects. So you can. Like I haven't been lately somewhat busy, so I haven't developed it a whole lot lately. But it's already containing a lot of ideas developed in the form of those diagrams. So if you then like looked at it and had like any feedback whatsoever or ideas, I'm definitely all ears. Or so yeah. At this point is mostly engaging just with the story ideas or the concepts.
That's great. I think I'll also buy the Sid.
Yeah. It's just your sound went off for a second, and now it's back.
Oh. Good. I think I'll also buy that Beyond Earth Sid Meier's. There's a lunar sale today at 75% off, so I can
100%
buy it for $10 and play it through. Get some ideas on how we can use that in the 12x format.
Yeah, that's the best game of this kind so far, which is a bit sad because it's been a while ago, and it's objectively worse than Civilization 5, like the main game. But they have some stuff going, like what they did that's not done in any other game in any other similar capacity equally well, even in the Civilization games, is exploration gameplay. Because what they did really well, I think, is that you have bunch of stuff that you can find on the planet, not just like in Civilization 5, for instance. There's ancient ruins that you can come up with your scout on and find, and you gain one of the like 5 bonuses you can get from that are cycling around from the ruins. That's like stupidly simple to the point that you basically ignore it after you've seen the 5 options. What they did in Beyond Earth is that there's like something is like an ancient alien ruins, and something is like a alien kraken nest, and so something is like a crashed satellite from like the failed settlement, like from like a previous attempt at colonization of the planet by humans. So you have 3 categories of artifacts: human artifacts, the living animal-like alien stuff that you can find on the planet, and the sort of ancient alien, super advanced technological stuff that you can find there. And you can sort of mix up the various artifacts, the various stuff that you find, and each combination gives you some sort of like a unique to unlockable boost for your civilization. That's very interesting. Like so from now on, your buildings can your cities can shoot through mountains, or from now on, like your embarked units are 100% stronger, or something like really powerful. So it really motivates you to do it. And also one of the victory conditions is tied into exploration, meaning like if you specifically search in the progenitor, that's the sort of name for the ancient advanced aliens. If you search specifically progenitor ruins, you have a statistical chance that you will find a piece of the signal from that advanced civilization that you need to unlock, one of the 2 pieces that you need to unlock to win the game by calling the ancient aliens. So that sort of that speeds up your victory, because you could do it with some sort of telescope, and technologically that would take a bunch of time. So that saves you basically like 50 turns toward that victory. And you can find it like the first time you step into those ruins, like in like turn 10. So it's really interesting stuff in terms of exploration. It's just the victory conditions are less, like not that interesting in the end. Is sort of the ends are not interesting, which is disappointing. But the early game is fun.
Excellent. I also happen to have 2 brothers that have been part of game development companies as well, that might be interested in programming or helping once it's kind of established. So I'll definitely try to sell this to both of them now, as a fun way to understand it better myself too.
I can, if you like I can even like set up, I can like talk with them myself about it if they would want to hear it. That's like 100%. If you know anybody like as a programmer yourself, if I understand it correctly.
Yep. Yeah, I am. IT.
Yeah. Because like so far everybody.
Sorry, it's so the idea being, did you have a name for the game? Are you going to call it Masters of the Future?
That's the code name for now. It's the code name of the project / story universe, because there's a whole philosophy to it. Because ultimately, what it is, if I wanted to do even quicker pitch, for the story part of it, is like I sort of devised this whole thing based on just like my understanding of like mythology, classical mythology, stuff like astrology, and science fiction. And then I realized that, like, wait a minute, like at that point I haven't read Foundation from Isaac Asimov at all. I have known of it, but I didn't know anything about the story, what it's about. And then I sort of, after I've developed this whole thing, I sort of started reading it, and it was like, oh, so there was a person who foresaw, like through psychohistory, so that's sort of like a made-up science that allows the person to see the future. So to sort of shape the future history of the galaxy to sort of achieve some sort of particular end, because he could foresaw things that other people were not able to. That's basically the main storyline of the main character in my story universe, with the fundamental exception that the whole model of time and predicting time is exactly opposite than what the Foundation is based on. So it looks like an intentional response to the Foundation, in much the same way like the Game of Thrones was an intentional response to some elements of the Lord of the Rings, like sort of countering some sort of stuff in there, like that. No, that's not how it would work. So it looks very intentional, and I won't be able to convince people that it wasn't intentional, that I did, but I really didn't know the Foundation before. It just like happened to be a response to something I haven't read. So the thing is, if you based it on astrology type stuff, the psychohistory is quantitative behavioral psychology and sociology. It's like you have huge numbers, trillions of people, then you can sort of generalize on the sort of behaviors and calculations. You have so much data. You can use that data and you can build a model of where everything's headed through social inertia. And the individuals play a very small part in that whole theory, because they're sort of like, it sort of predicts that there will be a great civil rights leader. It doesn't care who it specifically will be, and sort of doesn't matter who it specifically will be. Someone will assume that role created by the situation, and sort of it will just flow naturally in that direction. So that's the basic gist of psychohistory as a theory. And who knows, maybe there's some merit to that. but I have my doubts. And so in this sense, my point of view is very individualistic, meaning that like, and that's more like in Babylon 5, how the Sheridan, the main character, worked in Babylon 5 philosophically, is that they called him a nexus, meaning that like particular individual people, instead of like a huge chaotic system that's actually so chaotic that it's not predictable, that from the smallest thing can spiral out into a completely different outcome. So it's like a sort of chaos theory based sort of approach. But like there's a sort of way to find a system in the chaos, is that while the sort of universe is wildly chaotic, and in theory any small decision can butterfly effect into something unpredictable, no matter how big your computer is and how much data you have. So it's about the individuals, because if you understand the rules of the nature of the individuals, then you can understand something about their decision making, and so you will basically could develop a science of the nexus people. So you'll be able to sort of figure out what will be the characteristics of the individual person who would be able to, or willing to do what at a particular time. So it's like a very classical, ancient astrological point of view, that it's like about the sort of individual destinies of people, if you want to look at it the old way. But then more like a new way. It's more of a, that's why it's called Masters of the Future. It's like really there is no one predictable future. Based on the interplay of the individuals, there could be equally possible wildly divergent outcomes. So it's really about who masters their individuality the best of everybody else and then wins over everyone else. So it's also makes more sense from a gaming perspective, because that's basically you insert yourself as a player into that whole situation, that you could be the one, but that's not like a chosen one in like the ancient foretold sense, but in that like and just the key to being better than everybody else and making your vision of the future the actual future is that you need to become better at being yourself than everybody else.
Right. Awesome. Excellent.
Just to mention the practicality stuff, if you know anybody, like currently our biggest drawback, like we're missing a graphics designer person. Yeah. That's like if you could like find somebody who might be interested to in any capacity, even maybe for some money, maybe do something. Because like at this point we might as well just hire someone on Fiverr.
Yeah, it's possible. My brother's done a little graphics. He's built a few games. I can kind of maybe send you some of the games he's built. But it's very basic. So to get any kind of detailed graphics, it's mostly artistry, right? You need artists to kind of build the different character models, and then you can kind of try to animate them somehow if you have a good model.
It doesn't necessarily have to be heavily focused on 3D. Definitely not at the beginning. We could opt for, and that's actually a preferred strategy, because like I know a bunch of people who are like artists, like actual painters. So like I think I shouldn't have a difficulty getting, once we have some budget, people who would draw. And I have some concepts already, maybe show you at some of the time. I have some like concept art already made by some of my artist friends, but it's concept art. It's not like usable assets. So I can get a bunch of art for the game, and in these kinds of games that's used like loading screens or menu screens and stuff. Could be just 2D, even if the game itself is 3D, like oftentimes that's the part that they do in 2D. But the whole game doesn't have to be 3D at all. It even like as a strategy game that's supposedly plastic looking, it still might as well be isometric, fixed isometric, like StarCraft, because there's like to get a really good looking all around 3D modeled strategy game where you have a bunch of small models is like so complicated that for anybody but the biggest studios it's like not worth it, because it would look worse than nice 2D, which would be much cheaper to produce.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of good indie games that don't have a lot of graphics, but they're still really good games, and so I agree that you don't really need a ton. You just need to kind of a couple images for each thing, for each particular tree that you want to follow, and each major event that you want to kind of show. You need a couple of pictures, and they don't even have to be animated, really. They could be static pictures for the most part.
Yeah, because at the beginning it's more about demonstrating that the game system is fun than like it doesn't have to look great immediately.
The math and the story are definitely the key. The graphics can come way later, and so I think it's great. Well, I'll put some thought into it, run it by my friends and my brother, and we'll see where it leads us. But I think this is definitely a lot of potential. The last question I have for you today: are you interested at all in keeping IP for this, or are you completely 100% open source as far as sharing it with people? Like if I share this with enough people, someone might love it and say, "Oh, now I'm going to copyright it or IP it somehow," right? What's your
Well, that's a very good question, a very important question. That we will have some discussions, more discussions. We had some already with my friends with whom I would be developing the game, because we have very different philosophies as people. Which at some point we will have to sell it somehow, and then we will have to choose how we will actually do it. Personally, even if like made the games, then I would want to, I guess, control at least for a while in the normal sense, like sort of the pure authorship stuff, meaning like stories. Like if I like particularly like write particular stories or characters, at least for a while, I would probably, like it's normal to do, would like keep them as my own, even though of course I would never like sue somebody who's not using them non-commercially. So maybe I will have some sort of specified license that like if you want to use it for commercial purposes, then you have to talk to me. Otherwise, I forgot which specific license it is, but that's one of those like more Creative Commons licenses. It's like one of them is like you can like do whatever as long as it's not commercial. Is basically the default. Like the fully, I don't. The only reason why I wouldn't go fully open immediately is because precisely like somebody would just commercially try to screw me over. That's the only, because I'm not necessarily wanting to support people who only are interested in making more money and stealing other people's ideas. So I guess as for the sort of 12x system, the 100% that it's like open source. Like you want to use this sort of like as a diagramming system or whatever. Like if I wanted to make money in relation to that, yeah, I could give like lectures about it or write books about it and sell those. But the general idea would definitely be open source. It's like anybody wants to use it. For anything, like 100%. It's like I would like to would enjoy knowing about it, like the kinds of projects that people are working on, but it's not a strict requirement, and I don't necessarily have to be credited. It's just nobody should be claiming that they invented it. Type stuff. I guess that's the line.
It'll all come back to you as the father of 12x somehow, as far as the creator of it.
Yeah, like either as like the diagramming system, which technically I guess to name it something different, like the diagramming system I would separately call the 12-fold path, because that's basically sort of shows that it's inspired in mythological stuff, but it's also explaining how it works. Then in terms of the 12x as a gaming system, then I would very much like other people to use it. That's like the opposite would be some game studios, when they develop a system like this, they try to patent it. So there are some patented game features, and I think that's like the evilest thing ever. So I would definitely not patent like a game system. It's just like it would be kind of a bad form if somebody like in relation to particularly the story of the games or just story of the books, was like selling their own merchandise about the story stuff. Like I guess that would be maybe a bit iffy, but I guess like I'm very unlikely to sue anybody, especially not until I'm like if I'm ever fabulously rich. Like if I was fabulously rich, maybe I could pick court battles to just like make a point. But that's not really the issue. Like, so to answer it simply, not 100% fully open to everybody for all purposes, but mostly free and open for most purposes.
Yeah, I think the main hope or challenge is making sure that it's closed enough to the point where someone else can't take it and patent it and prevent you from ever using it or prevent us from ever developing it, right? That's, I think, the main thing that we will have to be careful of from a legal perspective. If, as this takes off or gets bigger, is to making sure that you hold on to the control of it.
Yeah. So at the very least, I think the absolute minimum is actually the license, the Creative Commons license, which allows even commercial use, but under the requirement that every commercial stuff that's produced has to be published under the same license.
Right.
That's the minimum, meaning that like if somebody else does something else with it, that also has to be accessible to everybody else. So that's how we can also limit it, which also the main corporations wouldn't necessarily, the biggest ones wouldn't really like, because they would want to have exclusive rights to whatever they created.